April 1970. Paul McCartney sits in his home recording studio at Cavendish Avenue in London, holding a press release that will change his life forever. The document is brief, just a few questions and answers, formatted as a self-interview to promote his debut solo album, McCartney. But buried within the promotional copy is a statement that will make headlines around the world and cement his reputation for years to come as the man who killed the Beatles. Q. Are you planning a new album or single with the Beatles? A. No. 4 simple letters, 1 syllable. But those 2 letters, N and O, will transform Paul from beloved Beatle to public enemy number 1. The press release is sent out on April 10th, 1970. By April 11th, newspapers around the world are running variations of the same headline: Paul McCartney breaks up the Beatles. The BBC leads with it. The Times of London makes it front-page news. In America, the New York Times runs a story with the headline, Beatles breaking up, McCartney announces. Radio stations interrupt regular programming to make the announcement, as if reporting a national tragedy. Fans gather outside the Apple offices in London, some crying, some angry, demanding to know why Paul would do this. But what the press doesn't know, what the public doesn't know, is that Paul isn't the one who wanted to leave. Paul is the one who wanted to stay. Paul is the one who fought to keep the band together while the others walked away. And now, through a cruel twist of fate and timing, he's being blamed for destroying the thing he loved most in the world. The truth is more complicated. In September 1969, during a band meeting, John Lennon announced he wanted a divorce from the Beatles. "I want out," John said flatly. Paul, George, and Ringo sat in stunned silence. Paul tried to argue, tried to convince John to reconsider, but John's mind was made up. However, their manager, Alan Klein, convinced John to keep the decision private while business negotiations were ongoing. So they agreed. The Beatles' breakup would remain a secret. For 6 months, Paul lived with that secret, hoping against hope that John would change his mind, that they could find a way forward. He watched as John released solo singles with Yoko, as George worked on his own album, as Ringo did film projects. The band was clearly over, but nobody was saying it publicly. Paul felt paralyzed, unable to move forward with his own solo career because it would look like he was abandoning the Beatles, unable to work with the band because the band no longer existed in any meaningful way. By early 1970, Paul was sinking into depression. He stopped shaving. He stopped getting dressed. He drank heavily, starting earlier and earlier each day. Linda watched helplessly as her husband disintegrated, spending entire days in bed, refusing to see friends, barely speaking. "I've lost everything," Paul told her one night, drunk and weeping. "The band is gone. My best friend hates me, and I can't even tell anyone because we're supposed to keep it secret." So Paul did the only thing he could think of. He made an album. Alone in his home studio, he played every instrument himself, recorded every part, produced every track. The album, simply titled McCartney, was raw and unpolished, deliberately so. It was Paul's attempt to strip away the polish of Beatles productions, to be honest and vulnerable. Songs like Maybe I'm Amazed captured his desperation and his love for Linda, who had become his lifeline during the darkest period of his life. But when Paul delivered the album to Apple Records and asked for a release date, he ran into immediate opposition. Alan Klein wanted to delay it because a new Beatles compilation album, Let It Be, was scheduled for release around the same time. Klein argued that 2 Apple releases so close together would hurt sales. Paul disagreed. He wanted his album out. He needed to move forward with his life. The dispute escalated. Klein was furious. Ringo visited Paul's house to try to convince him to delay the release. The meeting was tense and uncomfortable. Paul refused. "I'm not postponing my album," he said. "I've waited long enough. I've put my life on hold for 6 months while everyone else does their own projects. This is my turn." Ringo left, and Paul felt the full weight of the situation. The band was fracturing along lines he'd never anticipated. He realized that if he released his album with a vague press release, the media would speculate endlessly about the Beatles' future. Better, he thought, to be honest. Better to say clearly what everyone already knew privately. The Beatles were finished. So Paul drafted the press release. He made it look like promotional Q&A for the album, hoping to soften the blow. But when he came to the question about the Beatles' future, he wrote the truth. No. No plans for new albums. No plans for new singles. He didn't explicitly say, "The Beatles have broken up," but the implication was clear enough. What Paul didn't anticipate was the backlash. Within 24 hours of the press release, he became the most hated man in popular music. Fans who had screamed his name in adoration now screamed it in anger. Radio DJs who had played Beatles records non-stop for years now attacked Paul on air, calling him selfish, greedy, a traitor. Letters poured into Apple Records and to Paul's home, many of them vicious. "How could you destroy something so beautiful?" one letter read. "You've killed my childhood," wrote another. Some letters included death threats. The other Beatles were furious with Paul for different reasons. John was angry that Paul had stolen his moment. John had wanted to quit first, had announced it first, privately. But now Paul was getting credit for the breakup. George was angry that Paul had made a unilateral decision without consulting him. Ringo felt caught in the middle, loyal to all of them but unable to prevent the disintegration. The media narrative solidified quickly. Paul McCartney, the cute Beatle, the one who wrote sweet love songs, had destroyed the greatest band in history because he couldn't get along with his bandmates. Articles appeared analyzing Paul's ego, his need for control, his inability to share the spotlight. Music critics who had praised every Beatles album now turned on Paul, reviewing McCartney harshly and suggesting that without John, George and Ringo, Paul was lost. Paul retreated further into depression. He stopped reading newspapers, stopped listening to the radio, tried to avoid any mention of the Beatles. But it was impossible. Everywhere he went, people wanted to talk about it. Friends would call to offer support, but end up asking questions. Why did you do it? Couldn't you have found a way to compromise? Was it worth it? Linda became his protector, screening calls, turning away visitors, creating a bubble where Paul could try to heal. They spent more time at their farm in Scotland, away from London, away from the press, away from the constant reminders of what he'd lost. Paul worked the farm himself, feeding sheep, fixing fences, doing manual labor that required his body but not his mind. It was the only time he felt anything close to peace. But the worst was yet to come. In January 1971, John Lennon's interview with Rolling Stone magazine was published. Paul read it at the kitchen table in Scotland, and with each paragraph, he felt something inside him breaking. John's words weren't just criticism, they were character assassination. The interview portrayed Paul as a controlling tyrant who had ruined the Beatles with his need for dominance. John dismissed Paul's musical contributions, suggesting that Paul had only written one good song in his entire career. He called Paul's solo album garbage. What hurt most wasn't the professional criticism. Paul had received bad reviews before. What destroyed him was the personal betrayal. This was John, his partner, his friend, the person he'd spent more time with than anyone else during the most formative years of his life. They'd written hundreds of songs together. They'd shared hotel rooms, toured the world, experienced fame beyond imagination. And now John was telling the world that Paul was talentless, worthless, a fraud. Paul didn't speak for 3 days after reading the interview. Linda found him in his studio, just sitting in silence, not making music, not crying, just staring at nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "I don't understand," he said. "We built something beautiful together. We changed music together. And now he's saying none of it mattered. He's saying I never contributed anything." The depression deepened. Paul gained weight from drinking and eating irregularly. His face became puffy and haggard. He stopped caring about his appearance. Friends who visited the farm were shocked by the change. This wasn't the confident, charismatic Paul they knew. This was someone broken, barely functioning, going through the motions of daily life without any sense of purpose or joy. For months, Paul considered responding to John's interview. He drafted letters that he never sent. He imagined press conferences where he'd set the record straight. But every time he thought about engaging publicly, he stopped himself. What was the point? The world had already decided he was the villain. Anything he said would be dismissed as defensive, as making excuses. He'd lost the public relations battle before it even began. But in December 1970, Paul had done something that made the situation even worse. He'd sued the other Beatles to dissolve their legal partnership. The lawsuit was, from Paul's perspective, necessary to protect his interests. Alan Klein, whom the other three had chosen as their manager over Paul's objections, was making business decisions Paul disagreed with. The only way to separate himself from Klein's control was to dissolve the partnership legally. But the lawsuit was seen by the public as the ultimate betrayal. Not only had Paul announced the breakup, but now he was suing his former bandmates, dragging their private disputes into public court. The press had a field day. Headlines screamed, "McCartney sues Lennon." "Paul takes Beatles to court." The cute one shows his true colors. Editorials condemned Paul's actions as greedy and vindictive. Fans sent more angry letters. Some organized protests outside his home. John, George, and Ringo saw the lawsuit as a personal attack. From their perspective, they'd chosen Klein to manage Apple Records and the Beatles' business affairs, and Paul was undermining their decision out of spite. The lawsuit created new divisions, new bitterness, new wounds that would take decades to heal. Paul tried to explain his reasoning to anyone who would listen. "I'm not suing John, George, and Ringo," he said. "I'm suing the Beatles as a legal entity. I'm trying to end our business partnership because Klein is destroying everything we built. But nobody wants to hear that. They just see me as the bad guy attacking his former friends." The legal battle dragged on for years, generating new headlines, new controversies, new reasons for people to hate Paul. Every court filing became news. Every deposition was analyzed. The private financial details of the Beatles' empire were exposed, showing how much money was at stake, which only reinforced the narrative that Paul was motivated by greed. Through it all, Paul kept working. He formed a new band, Wings, with Linda on keyboards and vocals. Critics initially dismissed Wings as Paul's vanity project, his attempt to recapture Beatles' glory with inferior musicians. Early Wings albums received lukewarm reviews. Comparisons to the Beatles were inevitable and unflattering. "Paul McCartney and Wings are no Beatles," wrote one critic. Perhaps McCartney should have appreciated what he had before he destroyed it. But Paul persisted. He toured with Wings, playing small venues at first, building an audience from the ground up. He wrote new songs, pushing himself to prove that he could succeed without John, without the Beatles' name. Songs like Live and Let Die and Band on the Run gradually won over skeptics, demonstrating that Paul's talent hadn't disappeared with the Beatles. Yet even as his solo career gained momentum, Paul couldn't escape the shadow of the breakup. In every interview, journalists asked about the Beatles. "Do you regret announcing the breakup? Do you wish you'd handled things differently? Will the Beatles ever reunite?" Paul developed stock answers, polite deflections, ways to change the subject. But privately, the questions haunted him. In rare candid moments, Paul tried to explain his perspective. In a 1974 interview, he said, "I didn't break up the Beatles. The Beatles broke up. John wanted out. George wanted out. Ringo wanted out. I was the only one trying to keep it together, but because I was the one who finally said it publicly, I became the villain. That's not fair, but that's how it is. He elaborated, people think I announced the breakup because I wanted to go solo, because I was ambitious and selfish. But the truth is, I announced it because I had to. We'd been lying to the public for 6 months, pretending we might make another album when everyone in the band knew we were done. I just didn't want to lie anymore. I wanted to be honest, and I got crucified for it. But Paul's words didn't change the narrative. The story was already set. Paul McCartney broke up the Beatles. It didn't matter that John had quit first. It didn't matter that George and Ringo had supported John's decision. It didn't matter that the band was already fractured beyond repair before Paul said anything publicly. Paul's press release had made it official, and that made him responsible in the public's mind. The psychological toll was immense. Paul developed anxiety about public appearances, worried that fans would attack him. He had nightmares about the breakup, dreams where he was back in the studio with John, George, and Ringo, trying to convince them to stay, watching helplessly as they walked away. He woke up sweating, disoriented, grieving for something he couldn't get back. Linda became not just his wife, but his therapist, his protector, his lifeline. She absorbed his pain, listened to his fears, reminded him of his worth when he couldn't see it himself. "You didn't destroy anything," she told him repeatedly. "You created something beautiful. The Beatles happened because of you as much as anyone, and they ended because they had to end. That's not your fault." Slowly, painfully, Paul began to rebuild his sense of self. He realized he couldn't control the public narrative, couldn't make people understand his perspective. So he focused on what he could control: his music, his family, his future. He channeled his pain and frustration into songwriting, creating some of his most emotionally raw work. In 1975, John and Paul finally spoke on the phone after years of silence. The conversation was awkward but healing. John apologized for some of what he'd said in the Rolling Stone interview. Paul accepted the apology, though the hurt remained. They didn't resolve everything. The wounds were too deep for that, but they reached a détente, an agreement to stop attacking each other publicly. "We're never going to be what we were," Paul told John during that conversation. "But maybe we can be something new. Maybe we can be friends who respect each other's work and wish each other well." John agreed. It wasn't reconciliation exactly, but it was a start. Over the following years, Paul's reputation gradually improved. Wings released successful albums. Paul's songwriting continued to evolve and mature. Critics who had dismissed him began to acknowledge his talent. Fans who had condemned him began to soften, recognizing that the Beatles' breakup was more complex than they'd initially understood. But Paul never fully shook the label of being the man who killed the Beatles. Even decades later, in interviews, the question would come up, "Do you regret how the breakup happened?" And Paul would give his practiced answer, refined over years. "I regret a lot of things. I regret that we couldn't find a way to continue. I regret the lawsuits. I regret things I said and things others said, but I don't regret being honest about where we stood. The Beatles were over before I said anything publicly. I just didn't want to keep pretending." In 1980, when John was murdered, Paul's grief was complicated by unresolved guilt. They'd reconciled to a degree, but there was so much left unsaid, so many wounds not fully healed. Paul wondered if he could have handled the breakup differently, if he could have preserved their friendship, if he could have prevented some of the bitterness that poisoned their final years together. In the years after John's death, Paul became more vocal in defending himself against the accusation that he'd broken up the Beatles. He gave interviews explaining the full timeline, revealing that John had wanted to quit first, describing the impossible position he'd been in. Some people listened and revised their understanding. Others clung to the original narrative, unwilling to let go of the simple story. Paul was the villain who destroyed something beautiful. What Paul McCartney said when the world decided he killed the Beatles was, essentially, that he didn't. That the narrative was wrong, the timeline distorted, the blame misplaced. He said he was the last one holding on, not the first one letting go. He said he was honest when honesty cost him everything. He said he loved the Beatles more than anyone knew, and that losing them and being blamed for that loss nearly destroyed him. But the world wasn't always willing to listen, because the world needed someone to blame for losing the Beatles, and Paul McCartney's press release in April 1970 made him the obvious target. Fair or not, accurate or not, that's the story that stuck. Years later, reflecting on that period, Paul said something that captured the tragedy of his situation. "I didn't kill the Beatles. The Beatles died. I was just the one who had to announce the death. And when you're the one who delivers bad news, people shoot the messenger. I understand that, but it doesn't make it hurt any less."